Good morning, everybody. I hope that your AMS is going well. This is the Composing Women panel, and today we have three fantastic papers, I can tell you because I've already had the pleasure of reading them, by three expert women on the topic of women composers in the early 20th century. Our first paper will be given by Alexandrea Jonker. I'm sorry, I just realized I have the incorrect bio pulled up. My goodness, how embarrassing. Sorry. We all exchanged informal bios, but this is the time to read the formal one. So, Alexandrea Jonker is an assistant professor of music theory at the Crane School of Music in SUNY Potsdam. She received a PhD in music theory from McGill University in 2024. Her dissertation proposes an analytical methodology for Johanna Beyer's 4 earliest compositions that intertwine aspects of transformational theory and queer theory. Alexandra's secondary research interest is in oral skills pedagogy. Her mini-series on improvisation in the undergraduate core curriculum, co-written with Peter Schubert, can be heard in Season 4 of SMT Pod. Please welcome Alex.
I strongly believe a woman composer can have something special to say, in that there's a very particular woman's way of responding to the world. And this, in some basic way, is quite different from, and yet no less important than, a man's. Miriam Gideon. The Great Depression of the 1930s was a particularly difficult time for artists in America. In order to support musicians, conductors, and composers, President Roosevelt introduced the Federal Music Project as part of the New Deal program. Through the Federal Music Project, federal funding was available for music classes, hosting music festivals and orchestra concerts, and stimulating research on traditional American folk songs. This organization also founded and ran a weekly concert series known as the Composers Forum Laboratory. The forum provided a unique opportunity for composers to receive feedback from audience members in question and answer sessions following the concerts, with the goal of, quote, bringing about a closer relationship between composer and audience. Records of the concert programs and the transcripts for these Q&A sessions have been meticulously preserved in the National Archives at the Library of Congress, providing valuable insight into the reception of the pieces performed. Melissa DeGraff's research on the New York Forum highlights this concert series as a significant opportunity for women composers in particular to have their works performed and discussed. In total, 58 women composers took part in the New York Composers Forum between 1935 and 1940. The preserved transcripts from these concerts, however, reveal that for many of these women, the atmosphere during their Q&A sessions was often hostile, with audience members often criticizing and attacking both the composer's appearance and their work in gendered terms. DeGraff notes that the criticism from the audience was particularly harsh when aimed at women composers of modernist music. Johanna Beyer was one of these women. Beyer had several pieces performed in the concert series, appearing on the program for the May 1936 concert and again a year later in May 1937. Her music, which is largely grounded in the complex dissonant counterpoint style, was not well received by the audience. According to the transcripts, audience members described Beyer's music as chaotic and weird, containing, quote, pathological sounds and noises. One audience member asked, quote, Miss Beyer, you seem to have gone your male preceptors one better in search for strange and ineffective tonal combinations. Have you consciously adopted Rudyard Kipling's statement, the female of the species is deadlier than the male, as a guiding principle in your composition? Another asked if Beyer's pieces were, quote, mere brain children or if they emanated from the heart. Yet another asked if Beyer had ever been in love, suggesting that a woman writing dissonant music was incapable of such a feeling. Others still commented on Beyer's use of her body when performing at the piano, remarking, quote, the arm and hand playing on the piano is very unusual but not appreciated here. While similar comments were aimed at other women composers, Beyer's interactions with the audience are notable for their almost exclusive attacks on her compositions, as well as on her as a person. Following her 2 appearances in the Composers Forum, Beyer composed 2 songs for chorus, one entitled The Federal Music Project, composed in 1936, and the other called The Composers Forum Laboratory, composed in 1937. Both pieces are dedicated to Ashley Pettis, the director of the Composers Forum Lab, and I propose provide a valuable firsthand account of what it was like to be one of these women who were relentlessly berated and attacked by their audience members. In her article, Feminist Criticism in the Wilderness, Elaine Showalter, an American literary critic and feminist, proposes women's fiction can be read as double-voiced discourse, which contains, quote, 2 alternate oscillating texts simultaneously, a dominant discourse that reflects conventional gender roles, and a muted discourse subversive to it. She writes, quote, in the purest feminist literary criticism, we are presented with a radical alternation of our vision, a demand that we see meaning in what has previously been empty space. The orthodox plot recedes, and another plot, hitherto submerged in the anonymity of the background, stands out in bold relief like a thumbprint. How might we perceive 2 contradictory meanings in a piece of music? To answer this question, I turn to Robert Hatton, Janet Bourne, Michael Klein, Esty Scheinberg, Rachel Lumsden, June Park, and Yayoi Uno Everett, who have all examined music through the lens of satire and irony. Although the term irony has received many definitions by linguists and music scholars alike, almost all agree that irony is dependent on contradiction. Scheinberg defines one type of irony as one that is, quote, teleological and aims at a true meaning that lies somewhere behind the ostensible meaning of an utterance. Its presupposition is that both the recipient of the message and its sender share the same value systems and communication codes, thus providing the means for the reconstruction of the covert real message that is to be preferred. This sounds to me a lot like Showalter's definition of double-voiced discourse. In this paper, I propose that Beyer's choral pieces, the Federal Music Project and the Composers Forum Laboratory, can be read as satirical, presenting one narrative in the lyrics and a second contradictory meaning in the musical setting. I interpret this contradiction through the feminist lens of double-voiced discourse. Although the lyrics of the song suggest Beyer embraced her experience in the forum, the musical setting of these lyrics reveal a veiled criticism. In their work reviving Beyer's compositions, John Kennedy and Larry Polanski also note her satirical compositional tendency. They write, quote, even when daringly experimental, her work has a strong sense of formal coherence, along with a unique sense of humor and whimsy. Some of her works portray a sardonic sense of humor and a hint of embittered mockery. Although Kennedy and Polanski do not elaborate or suggest which exact pieces might be heard in this tone, I believe the Federal Music Project and the Composers Forum Laboratory are excellent examples of the style, if not the exact pieces the 2 authors had in mind. The Federal Music Project was composed in July 1936, just 2 months after Beyer's first appearance in the New York Forum. The lyrics, written by Beyer herself, are enthusiastic and positive, referring to the organization as a nucleus of a future so gay and a remarkable living idea with a future oh so bright. Beyer paints the picture of a supportive community with everyone learning and growing together, with love through games and fun. There's an almost campy quality to these lyrics due to the heightened level of affectation and exaggeration. Despite the overly optimistic tone of these lyrics, Beyer's musical setting undermines some of this positivity. Let's listen to the opening of the song. I'm going to play just the first strophe, and I want you to experience this piece solely as a listener if you haven't heard it before. So I'm going to hold back the score until after the first time you listen.
Ideas
piece is written in strophic form with the words "I know" from the first line of text repeated at the beginning and ending of each strophe in canon, starting with the soprano, answered in the alto a fifth lower, and then in the tenor, first on its own, then simultaneously with the soprano. The tenor and alto sustain their pitches, while the soprano finishes the first line of text. The text is then picked up by the basses, finishing the stanza with the last line repeated in canon, ascending through the choir, tenors, then altos, then sopranos. The strophe ends in the same way it began, with the text "I know" repeated in canon in the upper three voices, above a trilled F and G flat in the basses. The same music is repeated for the following four stanzas of text, with some rhythmic variation accommodating the varying number of syllables in each line. What about this music might allow it to be heard as satirical? Among the scholars I mentioned earlier who talk about musical satire and musical irony, several common themes arise. Musical satire often features violations of expected norms, either within a particular composer's oeuvre or within a style at large. There are often incongruities, where a particular passage of music seems out of place within the surrounding context, as well as distortions and exaggerations, such as excessive repetitions, sudden breaks, or other disruptions in the musical surface. For Robert Hatton and Michael Klein, the use of recitative can suggest an outside commentator entering the scene, prompting a shift in the musical discourse that invites the listener to take a step back from the music and consider an alternate meaning. Returning now to Beyer's Federal Music Project, there are several aspects of this song's musical setting that stand out to me as unusual or unexpected for a choral piece, violating norms of the style. The first is the vocal trill between F and G flat in the basses to start and end each strophe. Perhaps an emulation of the buzzing beehive referenced in the opening line, this technique is an uncommon choice, difficult for vocalists to perform solo, let alone within a section of the choir. This vocal trill is followed by a glissando, spanning a major sixth from F to D in measure 12. Again, this seems like an uncommon choice in a choir where it would be remarkably difficult for all of the voices in the bass section to stay together. While these features could prompt the view that this song is bad or inexperienced vocal writing, I hear them instead as purposeful distortions. By the time this piece was composed in 1936, Beyer had written several songs, including songs for voice and piano, voice and clarinet, and 4 other pieces for chorus. None of her other vocal music include these compositional peculiarities, suggesting something particular about this piece as an appropriate time to use them. It's puzzling little moments like this that stick out to me as satirical, almost a jab not only at the content of the lyrics, but also at the conventions of vocal technique and writing for chorus. Following the glissando, the main lyrics of the stanza are delivered by the basses in a percussive, chant-like fashion beneath the sustained pitches in the upper 3 voices. On the original score, Beyer makes a note that these lines should be marked, almost spoken, yet with the tonal pitch. Interestingly, on Beyer's original score, she only writes in the lyrics for the first stanza, and then tells the performer to repeat the same music with new text. This direction would be fine, except the text in each stanza doesn't have the same number of syllables, resulting in a kind of recit-like, ad-libbed rhythmic performance of the text. As with the vocal trill and the glissando, this ad-libbed approach strikes me as a distortion and a violation of norms. Beyer's other vocal music, and most other compositions for chorus more broadly, often feature more flowing melodic lines. Not only this, but the undefined rhythmic delivery of the text would be difficult to perform as an ensemble. To me, this compositional choice comes across as a purposeful act of defiance, an embittered mockery, not only of the style, but also the optimistic attitude of the text and the overall experience partaking in the Federal Music Project's concert series. The Composers Forum Laboratory was composed 1 year later, in 1937, following Beyer's second and final appearance in the Forum concert series. As with the Federal Music Project, Beyer wrote the lyrics for this song, and they too paint an optimistic picture, now of the concert series itself, at least at first. The song begins with describing a seemingly open audience, one that will surely hear you regardless of what kind of music you write. Old, new, abstract, true, fancy, plain, or for a variety of instrumentations, everyone would be given a chance. She then goes on to describe the era of composers as great, tense, vast, and immense, and as full of vigor and strength, before waxing lyrical once again about the Forum as the greatest active living idea. As with the Federal Music Project, there's a campy quality to these lyrics with their overly upbeat and exaggerated feel. The focus on the types of music being written and the quality of the composers is also a bit reminiscent of Schoenberg's 3 satires, also written for chorus, in which Schoenberg criticizes young composers, specifically Stravinsky, for composing in what he considered to be an outmoded style. Schoenberg writes in the foreword to the satires, "I cannot judge whether it's nice of me to make fun of certain things that were intended to be serious, show considerable talent, and are in part worthy of respect, knowing as I do that anything can be made fun of." While I'm not suggesting there's any direct link between Beyer's choral pieces and Schoenberg's, their common goal of drawing attention to what might be considered serious and respectable endeavors is noteworthy. In the final stanza of the composer's forum laboratory, the lyrics take a sharp turn, shining a light on the darker side of the forum, the one that Beyer and many of her women colleagues experienced. Here she writes that composers were criticized on the spot, whether you like it or not, and all is recorded, so you better be for it. This sudden radical shift in tone suggests that everything is maybe not as optimistic as the rest of the song lets on, which is backed up once again by the musical setting of the text. Again, before we dive too deeply into the music, I'd like to listen to part of the song so you can have an initial sense of what it sounds like. I'll play roughly the first half of the piece, ending at the bottom of the first column of text on this, the bottom of the first column of text you see on the screen, if you'd like to follow along with the lyrics. The song begins with a short piano introduction, after which the voices join in canon, singing the first line of text. First the sopranos, then the altos, then the tenors, and finally the basses, one measure apart, all at the same pitch level, albeit in different octaves. After the first 4 lines of text are completed in canon, the bass voice continues the text in isolation, with the occasional interjection from the upper voices, often in canon again, repeating lines from the first stanza. If you are a composer, and go to the forum laboratory. The piece ends with all 4 voices in unison for the first time, chanting the titular line, the composer's forum laboratory. Although Beyer's lyrics make it clear at the end of the song that there was more to the forum than the positive, encouraging, open atmosphere she presents at the start, the musical setting also creates what I hear as a satirical portrayal of these words. Once again, I'll turn to the idea of the violation of musical norms and distortions to help elucidate the musical satire present in this song. The first distortion comes at the very outset of the piece, before the voices even begin singing. The piano introduction, which continues in the background through the entire composition, begins the piece with an almost march-like quality. Melissa de Graaf also notes this as a march, suggesting, quote, the march-like rhythms convey the endless, unrelenting barrage of criticism and attack of forum discussions. And yet this march is off-kilter, in an asymmetrical 5/8 rather than a more conventional duple meter, undercutting the more serious tone associated with a march. This small but important distortion lends itself to a tone more in line with mockery or satire. The percussive rhythmic delivery of text in the bass voices that I pointed out in the Federal Music Project returns in this song in an even more prominent way. On the original score for this piece, Beyer adds a comment that the basses should chant with clear diction, and the text itself is marked with an ad-lib marking, together enhancing the russet-like quality of this section. Following the flowing contrapuntal voices in the opening of the piece, I hear the stark shift to the isolated rhythmic bass voices, in line with Klein and Hatton's observations that recitatives often prompt a shift in the level of discourse. While the piano hints at an alternate satirical reading of the text, this incongruous shift, like an outside commentator entering the scene, confirms this interpretation for me. The split between the upper, more lyrical voices and the recit-like basses, in my hearing, brings to life the split between the dominant and the muted levels of discourse, as mentioned by Showalter. The split between the levels of discourse is further confirmed when the tone in the lyrics shifts for the last few lines of text. Here, where the lyrics discuss the criticisms from the audience and the threat of the recorded transcripts, I find the bass voices difficult to discern under the canonic entries and sustained pitches in the upper three voices. To my ear, this is quite literally the veiled criticisms of the muted discourse. Let's listen. In closing, I'd like to return to the Miriam Gideon quote with which I began the presentation. Gideon remarks that women have something special to say, and that they respond differently to the world than men do. I believe the Federal Music Project and the Composers Forum Laboratory can be heard as Beyer enacting her feminist agency to share her experience as a woman composer of dissonant music in the Forum. By bridging together feminist musicology with work on musical satire, I hope to have shown one way a composer might incorporate two contradictory meanings in their compositions, one which seemingly reinforces gendered stereotypes in order to be seen as following the status quo, while the other subverts them. The concept of the double-voiced discourse, when applied to music, allows us to interpret meaning beyond what we see and hear on the surface of the score, to dig deep and give voice to a woman's way of responding to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was really fantastic. We have some time for questions, so if anybody would like to raise a point for Alex, you can come to the microphone.
That was an absolutely terrific paper, and these are amazing pieces.
Aren't they so cool?
Just but a really convincing reading on what they've done. I have a couple comments, but leading to a question. The introductory bass trill is indeed totally weird. Yeah. And the presentation of all that text depends on how good a choir you have. The glissando is actually not that hard. Okay. That's very doable. Yeah. But that, my question is, were these written for a specific choir or commission, or is she just getting her revenge at this horrible treatment she's received?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these two songs were written in a series of these 5 songs that she wrote right around this time. And she wrote the others for a competition that the Federal Music Project was putting on it was like a choral competition. And I think there was like a specific choir that was going to perform them. What's interesting is that these 2 pieces were not submitted for that competition. She submitted the others that she wrote at the same time and did not submit these 2. And I think it's pretty telling maybe why that was the case. So I don't know if she wrote these with that same chorus in mind or what exactly the situation was there, but they were written around the same time as those others that were submitted for that competition. Thanks for your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I especially love when women are really snarky in their music. I think it's really wonderful. Yeah. I'm really curious as to then how these works were received. You know, like how often were they performed? What were critics writing about these? Did they understand the satire and did they appreciate that, or did they double down on the criticism? Yeah, these were not performed in Beyer's lifetime, along with a lot of her music. As far as I know, the recordings that I played for you today are the only time that they've been performed and recorded, which is the case for a lot of Beyer's music. There's one recording, one like CD set of a bunch of her music, but not nearly all of it. So yeah, I don't think there are like critics of this music that have said anything about it, which is very sad because I think the music is very, very cool.
But yeah, thank you.
Hello, thank you again for a wonderful paper. Given the comments that we saw you speak about, I'm wondering if in the course of your research you have found where she was getting support for this from. Were they fellow women composers? Were they women performers maybe who were interested in her work and wanted her to put it forward? Maybe even musically enthusiastic friends? If she was going to take some risks like that, probably knowing the kind of criticism she was going to get, I have to think she had to have support from somewhere.
Yeah, that's a great question. Beyer is kind of this like kind of mythical figure that people don't really know a lot about. So her closest person in the composer world was Henry Cowell. She was very closely associated with him. She did a lot of like advocating on his behalf when he was in prison. But he really did not support her in the same way. There's lots of letters that have been preserved that were written between the two of them. In a lot of her letters, she's like, why aren't you putting my name forward? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And it's very interesting to see that she's like kind of yelling at him for not supporting her. And there was this, Kennedy and Polanski did this like kind of revival project, and they interviewed a bunch of composers that knew her, and all of their comments are like, we didn't really know her. And like, so I'm actually really not sure where she got support from. She did study with Ruth Crawford for a little bit, and her early music is very much in the style of Ruth Crawford, so I think she got some support there, but they were only in contact from a few months as far as I can tell. So yeah, that's kind of still a question mark that I have. Like, I think you're right that to write this kind of music, she probably needed some sort of community behind her, but I haven't found yet what that community was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more quick question, if anybody has anything. I actually had a quick question, if you don't mind. I found the kind of your reading so convincing of the satire and the irony in the music. I actually wondered if there's also a kind of musical context of parody that might be considered in addition to the kind of avant-garde context of the Composers Forum. I'm just thinking that there was quite an active American tradition of these kinds of glee clubs and songs that were very funny, and whether that is at all an apropos context to consider for these songs.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really thought much about parody specifically. A lot of the sources that I've read on like musical satire, it's like there's this kind of like fuzzy line between like what is satirical, what's ironic, what's parody, and like where are the divisions between them and where do they overlap. So I've mostly been focusing on like satire and irony, but I do think parody could be like an interesting additional lens or another lens to look at it, because like you said, there was a lot of like parody stuff happening at the time, so that could be another avenue to look at these. Yeah,
I think in particular, the vocal style of the performance is so artistic, but if you could imagine a more casual performance, maybe you would get a different result as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Let's thank Alex. All right, our next speaker is Virginia Jansen, who is a PhD student in historical musicology at the University of California, Davis. In 2024, she graduated magna cum laude from Boston University, with a Bachelor of Arts in Music, concentrating in historical musicology, and a minor in African American Studies. While there, she completed a research project on the influence of Black vernacular music on Florence Price's chamber music, and earned the Alice M. Brennan Humanities Award and Provost Scholars Award. Her research explores the reception and revival of women composers in the 19th and 20th century United States. Please welcome Virginia.
The Women's Building at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, or WCE as it'll be going forward, was erected in the summer of 1892 and demolished 2 years later, along with almost all of the other buildings of Chicago's White City. Despite the temporary nature of the physical building itself, the Woman's Building and women's work within it were memorialized through books such as Art and Handicraft in the Woman's Building. The preface of this book, which was released in 1893, described how the WCE, quote, afforded woman an unprecedented opportunity to present to the world a justification of her claim to be placed on complete equality with man, but also maintained that such progress would not immediately take place. It argued that the book would, quote, add to the light and perhaps hasten the coming of the day when that equality arrives. Or in other words, the exposition is where women made their argument, and the permanent record provided by the book would allow the argument to come to fruition. This book acts as a kind of paratext to the exposition. Focusing on literature, Gerard Genette argues that paratexts, such as titles, dedications, and epigraphs, but also something like an interview with an author after a book's publication, quote, ensure a text's presence in the world, its reception and consumption. Art and Handicraft at the Woman's Building aimed to do just that for women's work at the WCE. This illustration by Madeleine Lemaire accompanies the book. The central figure is a young white woman, standing amongst books, a vase, a sculpture, an inkwell and quill, and a spinning wheel. She holds paintbrushes and a palette, but is not painting. In the bottom left-hand corner, covered by Lemaire's signature, sits what I think is a musical score. If this small image represents music in the Woman's Building, it could very likely represent the music of Amy Beach. Beach's Festival Jubilate was one of 3 pieces by women composers performed at the building's opening ceremonies by the Exposition's chorus and all-male Exposition orchestra. In the next 6 months of the Exposition, women musicians performed 5 more of Beach's compositions. What argument did Beach's music at the Exposition make? In this paper, I explore how the connections between performances of Beach's music at the WCE and her scores contribute to a newfound understanding of paratexts in Western classical music. Ultimately, I ask how Beach ensured her and her music's presence in the world, and what that can tell us about women musicians in the fin-de-siècle United States. In her seminal essay, Passed Away is the Piano Girl, Judith Tick outlines how, quote, in 1870, women played the piano, harp, or guitar. By 1900, there were professional violinists and professional all-women orchestras. In 1870, women composers wrote parlor songs, even fewer wrote parlor piano music. By 1900, there had been premieres of concertos and a symphony by American women. Beach, as a pianist who became known for her work in large-scale forms, is a key figure in the development Tick describes. As a white, upper-middle-class woman, Beach was also the type of woman that Tick primarily focuses on, and the type of woman the WCE sought to represent and uplift. Because I am viewing the WCE through Beach's work there, I should note that woman at the WCE, especially in the musical contexts I'm focusing on, almost always meant white women. Within but closer to the end of Tick's 30-year period, the WCE is a helpful case study to parse the developments Tick describes. Women's music at the WCE was not merely a snapshot of the status of women musicians and composers in 1893. As the preface of Art and Handicraft in the Woman's Building reflects, the women leaders at the fair sought to argue for equality and therefore present its possibilities. President of the Exposition's Board of Lady Managers, Bertha Honoré Palmer, commissioned Beach to write a piece for the main dedication ceremony of the Exposition. However, she still had to wrestle with the male establishment. Theodore Thomas, the Exposition's musical director, and William Tomlins, its choral director, rejected the piece. Tomlins described it as containing so many ruffles and, quote, of ordinary merit as compared with men, but as a woman very good. In the wake of this decision, Palmer created a dedication ceremony for the Woman's Building to take place on May 1st, 1893, where Festival Jubilate took center stage. Anne Feldman argues that the WCE performances of large-scale works by women, quote, confirmed their legitimacy as composers, which couldn't be more true for Beach. Press coverage of Beach in the years before Festival Jubilate often positioned her as a young woman entering the scene, with descriptions such as, quote, an American aspirant for feminine musical honors, and declarations of, quote, confidence in her future success as a composer. Beginning with the Handel and Haydn Society's Boston premiere of Beach's Mass in E-flat in 1892, press coverage began to recognize her groundbreaking work in large-scale compositions. However, following Festival Jubilate, Beach began to be described as the representative American woman composer. Along with that status came comparisons to male composers, with one review praising Festival Jubilate as, quote, far beyond the majority of the works of its class written by Mrs. Beach's masculine compatriots, and descriptions of Beach as, quote, one of the most promising of American composers, sans the often requisite prefix of a woman. These newspaper accounts synthesize Beach's work with what the WCE meant to women and musicians in the United States. They reflect how, because the WCE was such a significant event, Beach's success there changed her reception. Returning us to the concept of paratexts, they both remind us of Beach's work at the fair and frame how we should remember it. However, they were written about her, not by her. Paratexts on Beach's scores are a way she could directly frame her own work. To think through that framing, I turn towards Beach's own records. Looking backward, likely from around 1907, Beach recorded the performances of her compositions between 1888 and 1894. In this small notebook, she demonstrated the interplay between her performing and composing. The first entry in the journal recounts her 1888 performance with the Boston Symphony Orchestra of her own cadenza to the first movement of Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 3. At the time of this performance, Beach was navigating shifting professional and personal obligations due to her recent marriage. Adrienne Fried Bloch recounts in her biography of Beach how, when then Amy Marcy Cheney married Dr. Henry Harris Aubrey Beach, a Boston physician, in 1885, she limited her public performances and turned towards composing due to some kind of agreement with her husband to uphold his position in society. This cadenza acts as a key bridge from Beach's early professional identity as a pianist to her growing composition career, a fact that is emphasized by Beach's archiving of its 1888 performance as the first of her compositions. By beginning with the cadenza, Beach prioritized large-scale performance and composition over earlier, smaller-scale performances such as in-home musicales or even a public vocal recital. In her journal, Beach labeled the cadenza's performance with MS, indicating that she used a manuscript. Arthur P. Smyth published the cadenza that same year. I'm interested in the distinction Beach makes between use of manuscript versus published score. Who does that change affect? It certainly looks different to the performer, and perhaps changes were made to the composition between then and its publication. However, publication also implies a seal of approval by the musical establishment. That approval is represented on the score through paratextual elements like the publisher's information or price listings, but also through the printing of written paratexts like titles, dedications, and epigraphs. In her journal, Beach kept track of performances of her works and their publications, but also how those two elements of legitimization interacted. The score of her cadenza, for example, represents the performance, ensuring the presence of the performance, but inversely, the performance also ensures the presence of the score. I propose the term paramusical writing to attend to these complexities. In my definition, paramusical writing are those paratexts which distinctly relate to, support, or act as evidence of performance. I focus today on paramusical writings on the published score and turn toward the score of Beach's Festival Jubilate to explore its application. Smyth published Festival Jubilate in 1892, the year prior to its premiere. Rather than the full score that must have been used at the WCE, the published score is for 4 voices and piano. Paying particular attention to the title page, the work was not dedicated to one person or ensemble. Instead, it commemorates the occasion of its premiere with a subtitle stating that it was composed for the dedication of the Women's Building at the World's Columbian Exposition. The score dates the performance of Festival Jubilate at the Exposition to 1892, rather than May 1893 when it actually happened. It preempted and imagined the piece's performance. Here, the Exposition served as an avenue to support the purchasing of Beach's piece, but to do so required manipulating the actual date of the ceremony. In the late 1892 review of Festival Jubilate we saw before, which described the piece as better than those of Beach's masculine compatriots, the subtitle is included but not the date. That's interesting. As paramusical writing, this subtitle framed the piece in connection to its future performance. The term paramusical writing also calls attention to the writer and the process of writing. While we don't know who wrote this subheading, for both Beach and Smyth, writing about Festival Jubilate's premiere at the Exposition would be ingrained with marketing the score's purchase. For Beach, it would be an act of self-fashioning, where she publicly associates herself with the piece's performance at the Exposition. As Beach's exclusive publisher during this time period, Smyth would also be concerned with the reception of Beach's identity as a composer. He sought to corner the market of publishing the music of American composers and often published their large-scale works at a financial risk that was made up for by their smaller works. Attaching the cultural significance of the WCE to the score was perhaps a way to mitigate those risks, but Smyth's approach also commercially connects Festival Jubilate with Beach's smaller pieces performed at the WCE. The arrangement for piano accompaniment, rather than full orchestra, markets it for maximum playability, but also engages with the occasion of the piece's performance. The published score of Beach's Mass in E-flat was also reduced from the original orchestral accompaniment to 4 voices and piano. It was a standard practice for choral music at the time, and the title page states that it is a, quote, vocal score with pianoforte accompaniment arranged from the full score. This statement does not directly reference the piece's premiere by the Handel and Haydn Society, but it does acknowledge the previous larger scale iteration of the piece. Festival Jubilate's subtitle does not directly acknowledge its reduction, but by virtue of its connection to a grand opening ceremony, it implies it. This writing, whether by Beach or Smyth, is a bridge between Festival Jubilate's performance and its published score, and the term paramusical writing embraces that adjacency to both iterations of Beach's music. After Festival Jubilate's performance in May, Beach returned to the Exposition in July for the Women's Musical Congress. Taking place outside of the Women's Building in the Memorial Art Palace, this 3-day event included both performances by women musicians and of the music of women composers. On the first day of the Congress, Beach performed 3 of her own piano pieces, including In Autumn and Fireflies, short works for solo piano, which had been recently published as part of her 4 sketches. The title page of the 4 sketches is adorned with both prices for the individual pieces and images of a pond and various flowers. In the sketches, we can see Beach's incorporation of the natural world in her compositions. Denise van Glaan theorizes that, in many of her earlier songs, Beach appealed to her primarily female audience of the parlor tradition by focusing on the, quote, fragile, vulnerable bits of nature, end quote, that were considered acceptable for women of Beach's class to interact with. This cover page and the title of In Autumn and Fireflies appeal to those consumers. However, another element of paramusical writing tells a new story. Underneath the titles of both In Autumn and Fireflies, Beach included epigraphs from French poet Alphonse de Lamartine's Poetic Meditations and New Poetic Meditations, respectively. Beach's choice of epigraphs connects her to and her music to their broader paramusical use. In particular, there is a long-standing association between Lamartine and the music of Franz Liszt. Through these Lamartine epigraphs, Beach associated herself with Liszt as both a composer and virtuoso pianist, while still operating within the space of a short, nature-inspired, parlor-friendly piece. On the same program as In Autumn and Fireflies, Beach performed her, at that time unpublished, Ballade. Beach had performed these 3 pieces previously several times. By continually performing them in a variety of venues, Beach framed them as representative of her compositional identity during this time. Christy Maddox argues that the WCE, quote, projected circulating ideas about women's changing status and role, end quote. At the WCE, Beach projected how she defined her own music, and in this performance in particular, paramusical writings on the pieces also speak to her own identity as a musician. Similar to the sketch's epigraphs, the title Ballade associates Beach with Chopin as another virtuoso pianist and composer. So at a time when Beach's husband wanted her to be a composer first, who performed sometimes but not often, in these compositions she related herself to well-known composer performers. When Ballade was published the year following the WCE, its title was changed to the anglicized Ballad, which likely served to further cement Beach's marketability as an American woman composer. Also on the piece's score was a dedication to Madame Fanny Bloomfield Zeisler. Beach met pianist Bloomfield Zeisler likely for the first time at the WCE. Bloomfield Zigler, who was touring internationally at the time, performed several concertos with the main Exposition Orchestra and also performed in smaller scale forms at the Women's Musical Congress. Ballad's opus number indicates that it was written from 1890 to 1891, so we can pretty safely assume that this piece was not composed for Bloomfield Zigler, and the dedication instead came with its publication. The dedication reflected the connection Beach and Bloomfield Zigler made at the WCE and likely aimed to elicit performances of the piece from Bloomfield Zigler, who did incorporate it into her repertoire and performed it as late as the 1915-1916 concert season. On the second day of the Women's Musical Congress, Beach and violinist Maud Powell played Beach's newly composed and soon-to-be published Romance for Violin and Piano. At the time of the WCE, Powell was a world-renowned violinist and was regarded as the first American virtuoso violinist. Like Bloomfield Zigler, she was also touring internationally at the time and took part in large-scale performances with the Exposition Orchestra, as well as helped to organize the Women's Musical Congress. Reviews of Powell and Beach's performance praised both musicians and the piece. Beach dedicated the piece to Powell, and the dedication is printed on the top of the cover page, violin part, and score. This is in contrast to the dedication to Bloomfield Zigler, which was only printed on the cover page. The placement of the dedication implies a stronger connection between Powell and the music itself. This piece was Beach's first foray into chamber music, and therefore her dedication to Powell invokes Powell's legitimacy as a violinist to support Beach's composition in that medium. Such a connection is also reflected in an 1894 review of the piece in the Chicago Music Review. The first sentence states that, quote, "This romance, dedicated to Miss Maud Powell, was performed by the gifted violiniste, accompanied by the author during the late fair," end quote. The piece's dedication and premiere are connected and framed here as key to the piece's reception. In contrast to Bloomfield Zigler's embrace of Beach's ballad, scholars have found no evidence of future performances of the romance by Powell. However, Beach's dedication to her created the illusion of a continued relationship on the score. On the last day of the Women's Musical Congress, Beach accompanied Jeanette Dutton as she sang one of Beach's early songs, Sweetheart, Sigh No More. Well, I'm not going to dig into the song's paramusical writing due to time, though I'm happy to do so in the question period if you're interested. The music itself tells us something about Beach's composite music at the WCE. This song rounds out the types of music Beach presented: a large-scale choral and orchestral piece, solo piano pieces, a chamber instrumental piece, and an art song. Sweetheart, Sigh No More is also intriguing as Beach used its melody as a base for the romance. Ballad is also based on a melody from one of Beach's previously published art songs. Through the programming of both Sweetheart, Sigh No More and the romance at the WCE, Beach took her time on the world stage to present her work as building on itself and demonstrated her own development as a composer. Beach's paramusical writings continue to tell that story long after the Women's Musical Congress ended or the Woman's Building was demolished. Analyzing the paramusical writing on Beach's scores draws out the connections between her music's performance and publication in her early career. Through the writing of these performances onto her scores, Beach fashioned herself, but also was fashioned by Smyth, as a performer and prolific composer of large-scale forms for a new era of women in music. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginia, for that wonderful paper. We have plenty of time for questions. If you could just please step to the microphone.
Okay, I'll start again. This is a really interesting paper. I'm curious about what else was going on at the Women's Musical Congress. I mean, it's a 3-day thing. Yeah. Are there speeches? Are there other pieces? Who's being performed? I mean, where does she stand in connection to what else was going on around her?
Yes, thank you. So there were speeches, there were many other pieces. It was kind of this great gathering of sort of the who's who of women musicians, white women musicians in the United States at the time. So off the top of my head, Maud Powell gave a speech about being a woman violinist and sort of advice on how to pursue that as a career. And a singer whose name is escaping me also gave a speech about how to pursue a professional career in as a singer. So that's another interesting aspect of thinking about professionalization at the time. So yeah, it was sort of this grand meeting. I need to look more into a lot of the congresses at the Exposition have these long programs that are sort of easily available. So I hope to find the musical congress one soon. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting paper. I'm really fascinated by your proposed term, paramusical writing. And I have a question about the extent to which that also includes aspects of the compositional process that occur after the primary act of composition. So, for example, the Beach Opus 34 violin sonata has a significant number of pastovers on it that occurred after she made her clean copy and was ready to submit to Smyth for publication. And we can see that she made these revisions after the act of composition because those pastovers are in both the piano full score and the violin part as well. So would you consider that kind of like returning to a piece and like those kinds of ephemera of the process to also be part of paramusical writing? Or does that fall, like essentially where's the overlap between textuality and critical edition and paramusical writing in your conception of the term?
Thank you so much. Yeah, the term is in its early conception, so that's an interesting add to it. I think depending on where those changes came from, whether she performed it and realized these changes needed to happen, I think might help it fit into the term. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. But thank you, that's really helpful.
Take your time.
Sorry, I had to do a marathon to get up here. I really appreciated your use of everything about the music and the score in your analysis. I think that's important in what we do, and I thought you brought it out beautifully. And I was interested in the allusions to other composers, the references to other composers, specifically male composers, and that were both performer composers. And what are the gendered implications of that, if any? Do you think that was some sort of trying to make herself official in some sort of way as a female composer?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate that question. During this time, as some of the press coverage showed, she was during her life, she was constantly being compared to men. It's kind of the famous Beach's "One of the Boys" quote as well. So I think she was definitely forming her identity in connection to sort of the people she had to compare it to, and the really successful and well-known male musicians at the time. I think Beach.
Oh. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think Beach is also at the same time thought of as more also a feminine composer with her focus in art songs. So it's an interesting to look at these early piano pieces and what they might tell us about her, how she was maybe wanting to move away or at least add in this other aspect that was less women-friendly at the time. Yeah. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for one or two more questions, if anybody would like to ask anything. If while people are still thinking of one last thing to ask. Virginia, I have actually a few questions. I really enjoyed your paper. I'm trying to decide which question to ask you, but I think I have a question about your research process, your research methods. One thing that you were very modest about is that, and I know this because I read Virginia's paper, most of your sources are archival sources, and I wanted to know more about your methods and what the state of the Beach archives are like, and what opportunities there are in the manuscript side of things, and also what kind of limitations there are at the moment.
Yes, so far I've done a sort of a cursory look at mostly things around the exposition, and Beach, as kind of some of the material showed, was doing this sort of self-archiving during her life, which made it possible to look at this little book, which I found super interesting, and also sort of big scrapbooks of press clippings. So I'd be interested, it's an extensive archive, be interested in looking more at the surrounding scrapbooks and collections of press clippings, and also looking beyond, because is Beach picking only the more positive reviews? I'm curious, probably.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole feminine practice of self-archivalship, right, and memory books and albums and things. I mean, it does make me wonder, though, about these published items and the paratexts on them. I was very curious about Beach's professionalization and who among her kind of mentors, business contacts, family members, maybe helped her develop this savviness that she very obviously had.
Yes, so she was a pianist from her early life, and then moved her first, but was also composing, and her first composition with Violets was published, and I don't remember the year, but early in the 1880s, and so she actually likely met Smyth through her husband, so it's really interesting, this don't perform, but yes, you should compose, and that connection that was maybe made that way, and then later in her life, when he passed away, her husband and Smyth passed away,
right.
And so she kind of lost her connection with that publishing house and started moving beyond when she had established herself more. But it's during those early years she was really working with Smyth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think we should thank Virginia, and well done. I'll just read her bio as she gets set up. Our final presenter this morning, still for a few moments, is Dr. Amy Zigler, who is Assistant Professor of Musicology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her research specializes in the music of the 19th and 20th centuries with a focus on the cultural study of chamber music, the social history of music in Germany and Great Britain, and the study of gender and sexuality in music. Her recent research centers on sociocultural implications of and autobiographical narratives in the music of the 19th and 20th centuries with a focus on the life and music of Dame Ethel Smyth. Her publications include forthcoming chapters in the Cambridge Companion to Smyth, which I can't wait to see in print, and published reviews in 19th century program music published chapters, in 19th century program music and women composers in New Perspectives, 1800 to 1950, and articles and reviews in the Opera Journal, 19th Century Music Review, and the Journal of the International Alliance for Women and Music, as well as liner notes for the Grammy Award-winning recording of Ethel Smyth's Der Wald. Please welcome Dr. Amy Zigler. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. A quick apology for my voice today. I made the erroneous decision to get a cold before AMS rather than at AMS. I would also encourage any of you sitting in the back, there are musical examples in the second half of the paper today, and they're a bit small, I think, so if you want to move forward to see those, please feel free to. Also, before we get started, there is a QR code here for the text in the musical examples that you'll be hearing later on in the program. I'll give everyone a moment to shuffle or get a QR code here. Okay. I feel I must fight for Der Wald because I want women to turn their minds to big and difficult jobs. With this famous quote, so much so that it has ended up on coffee mugs. Scholars have been inspired to examine the libretto of Der Wald for evidence of Smyth's proto-feminist tendencies. The music of Ethel Smyth's second opera, however, has been less investigated in part due to a limited number of performances, difficulty accessing the score, and until recently, no commercial recording. In 1902 to 1904, the opera received performances in Berlin, London, at the Met in New York, and in Strasbourg, but it was not staged again until 2021. Consequently, scholarship has focused on the libretto and the vocal score, examining gender representation and power dynamics through the text, with limited exploration of how the music conveys the narrative. With the release of the first commercial recording in 2023 and a second recording just this past September, it is now possible to hear the work multiple times as well as study the score, creating an opportunity to examine the ways in which the music of the opera conveys the narrative and depicts the characters. At its core, Der Wald is a battle between two women for the love of a man. While this battle is most assuredly conveyed through the text and stage action, it is also conveyed through the melodies of the main female characters. Although described as moral opposites, they inhabit the same vocal range. Over the course of the opera, the performers demonstrate the heroine Ruscien's triumph over the sorceress Iolanthe through the very notes they sing, using voice leading across multiple scenes to convey rising and diminishing power. Building upon the work of Wood, Liebitz, Gibbon, Curtis, and Thompson, and through an examination of the full score and the recording within the context of the libretto and the correspondence between Smyth and her librettist Henry Brewster, this paper will demonstrate the ways in which Smyth expressed through music the power of her female characters. At the turn of the 20th century, few women were composing and premiering operas, leaving few examples of how a woman might portray female characters on stage. Ethel Smyth was one exception to this. Although her early works were primarily instrumental, she turned her hand to opera in the 1890s and premiered 3 operas in the span of a decade: Fantasio in 1898, Der Wald in 1902, and The Wreckers in 1906. Early in her career, Smyth experienced microaggressions and gender discrimination. These included rebukes by older male composers, assumptions that she received help with her compositions, and even being misnamed in the papers. While she publicly downplayed her reaction to this discrimination in her later published memoirs, Smyth did acknowledge these prejudices as early as 1899 in private letters to her librettist Henry Brewster, even as she was developing the characters for Der Wald. By 1902, her attitude had begun to shift to activism. Smyth wrote the following in a November 1902 letter to Brewster as she was deciding to travel to the United States to oversee the production of Der Wald at the Met, and this is the origin of the quote I stated at the beginning. Quote, "But there is a certain amount of fighting for the vault which I feel I must do. I want women to turn their minds to big and difficult jobs, not in ships coasting around the shore afraid to put out to sea. I am not afraid, and in my way an explorer who believes supremely in the advantages of this bit of pioneering," end quote. As noted at the beginning of today's talk, Smyth did include part of this letter in her 1940 memoir, but she claimed it was the sole example of her encouraging other women in the, quote, "long and painful fight against prejudice," end quote. And yet, in February 1903, while on the press junket leading up to the New York premiere, Smyth elaborated on this theme, saying, quote, "For you must know that the life of any composer who loves his art better than his ease, and especially that of a woman musician, is one long battle from start to finish. It seems to me the hour has struck for woman's work in the music world. I happen to be on the hour, and I feel that I have a duty to all womankind in persevering in this field," end quote. Thus, with her second opera, Der Wald, Smyth had begun to acknowledge that her fight to become a composer had bigger implications. Yet, in the existing Smyth scholarship, the above primary sources have remained unexamined. While Smyth's later operas, The Wreckers and The Boatswain's Mate, allow for more obvious feminist interpretations and have been the focus of scholarly examination, in part due to recordings and recent performances, the prevailing assumption has been that Der Wald, seem to predate Smyth's overt feminist inclinations and instead present a more conventional approach to gender with its innocent soprano and villainous mezzo. An understanding of this work begins with descriptions of the plot and characters by Smyth and Brewster. In 1896, they had been brainstorming a plot, and Brewster sent her this synopsis, quote, "A scene in a forest, a pair of simple lovers, a lustful queen out hunting, and a catastrophe. The whole thing one act reduced to elemental themes," end quote. This outline was then turned into a one-act libretto by Smyth, which she set to music between 1899 and 1901. The simple lovers, Rusien and Heinrich, are about to be wed. Iolanthe is the lustful mistress of Count Rudolph, and she desires Heinrich. The catastrophe Brewster names is manifold. Heinrich has secretly killed one of the Count's deer, a capital crime. Iolanthe tries to seduce Heinrich, but he refuses. She vows to have him anyway, which angers Rudolph. And when it becomes known that Heinrich has committed this crime, Rusien asks Iolanthe to save him. Rather than kill him outright, Iolanthe offers him a place at her side. He chooses instead his love for Rusien and death. He is killed, and Rusien collapses on his body. Smyth and Brewster discussed and developed the characters through their correspondence and in in-person meetings in 1896. In the letters, Iolanthe is described at least 11 times, while Rusien is only described twice. For example, Iolanthe is described as capricious, licentious, wicked, and lustful on 3 different occasions. Rusien, however, is only, quote, a sympathetic heroine who should be, quote, as pure and fresh and simple as forest strawberries, end quote. 6 years later, Brewster also provided the synopsis for the published score, and Smyth wrote stage directions, which were also published. Here as well, Brewster and Smyth focus more on Iolanthe than Rusien. He described Rusien in the 1902 score as, quote, a peasant girl engaged to a young woodcutter. But her actions are omitted entirely from his synopsis. Smyth's stage directions add a little more detail. Most notably in the final death scene, Smyth describes Rusien's final rush towards Heinrich as he is killed and her declaration of defiance before she too dies. In these summaries, they portray Rusien as a reactionary character with no direct influence on the plot. By contrast, Brewster describes Iolanthe, quote, as a woman of cruel instincts and unbridled passions, supposed to be a witch and dreaded with superstitious fear. She has complete sway over Count Rudolph, whom she despises as a weakling, end quote. Likewise, Smyth described at length Iolanthe in her stage directions in the following manner, quote, the appearance of this terrible and beautiful woman, the dreaded lady of the forest whom the peasants believe to be a witch, must coincide with her adventurous, demoniacal character, end quote. Both Brewster and Smyth devote more space to Iolanthe, placing greater importance on the character, even though she is on stage less. Rusien is practically ignored. These published character portrayals by Brewster and Smyth, along with the libretto and the score, formed the evidentiary basis for scholarly examinations of the 2 female characters over the past 60 years. Most recently, Judith Liebitz wrote about the power and agency of the female characters, but she focused entirely on the libretto, omitting any musical analysis of the characters. In all the secondary scholarship, Iolanthe is the focus, with brief, if any, discussion of Rusien. In fact, scholars paint Rusien as passive or meek. Liebitz does suggest that Smyth moved beyond the innocent girl stereotype, noting Rusien's defiance and heroic efforts to save Heinrich, but she does not examine how this is portrayed in the music. Discussions of Iolanthe, meanwhile, have been much more detailed, perhaps in part because she is the focus of Smyth and Brewster's prose, and perhaps because she is more immediately intriguing, a magical sexual female character who doesn't die. Elizabeth Wood speculated on the connection between voice type and character, postulating that, quote, Iolanthe's mezzo voice of considerable dramatic power represents a conquering and unconquerable force of female desire, end quote. In fact, only Wood brings attention to voice type, but she does not compare or contrast the voice types of Iolanthe and Rusien, nor does she make a connection between the character's power and Smyth's emerging activism. I had the fortunate opportunity to attend the recording session of Der Wald at the BBC studios in January 2023. As I listened to this opera, I began to question my previous assumptions and the characterizations of previous scholars. I had expected an aggressive mezzo and a more passive heroine, which was not the case. I had also expected more contrasting soprano and mezzo voices in terms of pitch, if not also in terms of timbre, in part because previous scholars had described Iolanthe as a mezzo and as heavy, but also because a soprano had been cast in the recording and a mezzo had been cast as Iolanthe in the recording. However, in the 1902 Schatzun edition, Rusien is listed as a soprano, and the role of Iolanthe is listed as a soprano, with the option for a mezzo in parentheses. Moreover, Smyth gave the two female characters the same range, C4 to B5, with an optional C6 for Rusien. In practice, the role of Iolanthe was premiered primarily by lyric or dramatic sopranos, Ida Hiedler in Berlin, Olive Fremstad in London, and Louise Royce-Welche in New York. Only Margaret Metzeneuer in Strasbourg was a mezzo-soprano, and she was known for her wide range. The role of Rusien was performed initially by coloratura Maria Dietrich, then by soprano Josephine Loza-Kratz and dramatic soprano Johanna Gadsky. Vocally, then, the two characters are portrayed as equals. Indeed, Elizabeth Wood argued that the opera was, quote, a contest of female power, end quote, a characterization that is supported by the parallel ranges and Smyth's treatment of the two lead female characters who are fighting over Heinrich. But how does this contest play out in the music? One of the most subtle yet powerful ways that Smyth musically represents the two female characters' battle over Heinrich and establishes their respective power is through competing climactic high notes over several scenes. The one-act opera has 9 scenes plus a prologue and epilogue. Scenes 1 through 4 introduce the audience to the villagers and to Rusien, establishing the plot of their upcoming nuptials and Rusien as our heroine, as one of us. Scene 5 introduces Iolanthe and presents the conflict of her temptation of Heinrich. In scene 9, the two women confront one another. Rusien's power is foreshadowed early in the opera, but in such a casual way as to almost go unnoticed. In scene 2, she asks the community to join her in a dance, singing her first high B, circled here in red, during this celebratory, joyful, and communal moment. But the note is surrounded by the chorus and full orchestra, minimizing its impact. The more powerful moments occur in scene 4, when she meets Heinrich. Initially, she is delighted to see her hero, her brave warrior, and this is conveyed by a high A flat circled in red. But later, she confesses her fear of Iolanthe to him, rising to a high B flat circled in red on the left. This is followed later by her highest note yet, telling him to go for her own safety. In the BBC recording, Romanoff chooses to sing the optional high C, circled in red on the far right, in one of the most dramatic moments in the opera. Let's listen. Following this plea, Heinrich comforts her, and they vow to trust in each other and the forest. In this performance, I hear Rusien as powerful and strong, conveyed both by text and pitch. During this emotionally charged scene, Rusien's melodies rise from G to A flat to B flat and even to an optional high C before descending back down, as you can see in this reduction. Now, immediately following in scene 5, we meet Iolanthe, who happens upon Heinrich in the forest and decides she must have him. In her efforts to seduce him, she reaches the same melodic high points as Rusien in her first two scenes. Like Rusien, she sings the high B in an emotionally charged moment, but rather than inviting him, the way Rusien invited the villagers to join her in a dance, Iolanthe commands him to join her. Let's listen.
Then be mine the choice, my gallant huntsman, you joy today. I see in your eye the gleam that I love, the glance that quails not. Noble arms we will train you to wield, and this I know, young Heinrich will yet
He refuses her offer, and taken aback by his rejection, in the next passage she reaches only a high A, setting the stage for her revenge and the downfall of the lovers, while also hinting that she may not ultimately prevail. Yet in her initial scenes and interactions with Heinrich, Iolanthe appears to have equal vocal power to Rusien, hitting the same high A's and B's reduced here. By scene 9, Heinrich has been accused of poaching the Count's deer and sentenced to death. Rusien, unaware that Iolanthe and Heinrich had met, or that Iolanthe had already decided his sentence, demands that Iolanthe save him. Iolanthe, feigning mercy, tells Heinrich to follow her or die, but melodically she fails to ascend to the powerful high B, singing only in A-flat, representing her loss of power over him. Following this passage, Heinrich rejects her for a final time, choosing love and death. In the end, it is Rusien who sings the final climactic high B as she joins Heinrich in death, singing "Love has the victory, love and death," before collapsing onto Heinrich. As you can see in this reduction of all 9 scenes, Rusien's and Iolanthe's respective first 2 scenes establish their vocal equality, despite their character differences. Both sing high A, B, A in climactic moments during their respective first 2 scenes. But while Iolanthe's melodic high notes fall over the course of her scenes, Rusien demonstrates that she is actually the more powerful character as early as scene 4. By the end, it is Rusien's high B that overpowers Iolanthe's A flat, solidifying Rusien as the more powerful of the two, as the victor. Smyth does not discuss with Brewster why she wrote the vocal lines this way. Thus, we do not know if it was a conscious compositional decision. The impact of this vocal writing, this trading of musical power, remains nonetheless. Between writing the libretto in 1896 and composing the score in 1899 to 1901, Smyth created equally powerful female characters. Smyth's opera is unconventional in that the heroine and villainess were both originally soprano roles with the same tessitura. Unlike works Smyth admired, such as Carmen or Cavalleria Rusticana, there is not one character with the highest note or the lowest note. Both women in Der Wald have a voice and agency, not just the powerful Iolanthe, but also the heroine, the simple and pure Rusien. In this way, Smyth created characters who defied social norms and gendered stereotypes at the turn of the 20th century, foreshadowing the more overt feminist works she would write in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for that fascinating paper. If there are any questions, you can please come up to the microphone.
I have to keep up my streak. Amy, that was a terrific paper. Just a great job of I mean, vice is more interesting than virtue, but, you know, she's got a really good part. You said they do have equal low notes. They all go down to I guess it's middle C would be that. Does one of them spend more time down there than the other, or they just touch on it? Is there, have you looked at the low notes in this?
Sure. They both get down to middle C, to that C4. Iolanthe a couple more times than Rusien. Rusien, it's, I think, twice that she hits that middle C. Most of the time, in their low end, they're hovering around D or E, and it's only on occasion that they drop down to that middle C. And similarly with the high notes, they hit those at important moments, and mostly they're around G, F, that area. And for Iolanthe, she's hovering around D for some of her highest places until those moments where she really needs to be forceful.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting to actually hear it. I'm wondering if there are other things that would support your analysis, like key associations or leitmotifs or thematic reoccurrences or just anything else you might be able to tell us.
Absolutely. And this is a part of a larger project that's working towards a journal article. Aidan Thompson has done some great work looking at key areas of the different scenes and how they relate, and especially in relation to Wagner and those influences. As it specifically relates to the vocal lines of the female characters, the notes they are hitting come at certain points in a chord or the harmonic landscape. Oftentimes they are singing the tonic of that phrase. Or, you know, in one of the anguishing moments for Rusien when she says, it's the seventh of the harmony. So there are some intentional ways that Smyth is setting that voice line to create either more emphasis by giving them the tonic or more tension through the seventh. For Iolanthe, she starts to sing more the third or the fifth, so notes within the harmony rather than, you know, that root. And so I think that might be another way that she is diminishing Iolanthe's power as she goes on. So there are some elements there in terms of how the voice is set. One of the other things I'm looking at is how the orchestra is working behind the scenes with the voices. There isn't as much work with leitmotif as one might expect by someone somewhat influenced by Wagner. The orchestra doesn't have a subtext or a counter narrative, but there is the hunting motif for Iolanthe that comes back, but then is recontextualized for Rusien at the end in a major context. And so in effect, Rusien takes Iolanthe's hunting call, her motif, and adopts it, appropriates it for herself. So there's some really fascinating things that are happening beyond just what I could cover in today's paper. Mm-hmm.
I hope this is not too a far field or out of the blue, but given Ethel Smyth as a queer woman, I'm curious if, especially these voices being so close together, if there's a room somewhere for a queer reading of what's going on in this opera?
Absolutely. And there's also room for autobiographical imposition. So the librettist Henry Brewster, who she met in 1882 when he was married, and when she met them, she was more attracted to his wife than to him, And that scandal played out over the course of several years. Julia, the wife, eventually died in 1895 while they were collaborating on Smyth's first opera. It's a long story. And so this idea of two women battling over a man has kind of obvious implications, but then also her interest in Julia. There's another woman, Elizabeth von Herzogenberg, who plays into this scandal. And so, yes, there's very much room for an interpretation of this as female voices competing with and for one another. And that placement of equal tessitura definitely creates room for that.
This was great, thank you. I'm curious, and this is just me perhaps forgetting things from the memoirs, but you brought up the sort of discrepancy between how Smyth represents this, in the 40s, and what she's saying in her press appearances at the time. And I'm also wondering if her views of this opera and sort of the circumstances around it, if those change, like volume to volume in the memoirs, just because there are so very many of them.
Right. So with her telling of Der Wald, that doesn't shift that much from Streaks of Life, which is where she first writes about it in a passage called A Winter of Storm, to then later on in What Happened Next, where she talks about it again. The details, the facts of those stories are pretty consistent. It is fascinating that Smyth, in her memoirs, downplays when she became politically active. She says, it wasn't until 1910, and I heard Emmeline Pankhurst, and that's when I became involved. And it turns out, at least privately, she is very much aware of the gender discrimination that she is facing. She's talking about it with Brewster, who was a close confidant. And she is expressing these, but those are private feelings that she wouldn't have felt comfortable expressing in public. And I'm not quite sure why she doesn't acknowledge that she was, had these ideas and was politically active in fighting for women in music that early. She seems to describe it in What Happened Next as almost not wanting to burden others with it. That this is her fight and she's fighting for this, but I had the fortitude to do it and most didn't. So she's also putting her out there as an exception to the rule, that I'm strong enough, I'm fit enough to withstand the barrage, and rather than encourage others who might not be up to the task, I'm just going to forge ahead and pave that path for them.
Thank you. Well, it is 12:15.
Okay.
So thank you very much for your paper and for all of your questions and your kind attention. Thank you very much.